right, I think we are going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here. I am Nestor Davidson, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and one of two faculty directors for the Urban Law Center. So I come wearing many hats and welcome you on behalf both of the Law School and the Urban Law Center. We're joined by Anisha Mistry, who's the director of the Urban Law Center, and Professor Brian Glick from the Community Economic Development Clinic. So we're very excited both for the talk and for the opportunity to have Paula Segal among us. Among many other accomplishments, including author, and someone whose LinkedIn page I found out today has the word rabble-rouser on it.
Oh man, I haven't updated my LinkedIn page.
I have not seen that on a LinkedIn page before, but very apt. Professor Segal is the founding director, executive director, and director of policy and advocacy of 596 Acres, an organization dedicated to transforming vacant public land into community resources. And we'll hear obviously a lot more about that exciting work today. And Professor Segal is also very involved in bringing a real estate investment cooperative to life for New York City. I'm not sure if that's going to be on the agenda today, but it's a footnote. But certainly other conversations to come. Professor Segal has joined us this spring as an Urban Law Center Fellow and as an adjunct instructor at the Community Economic Development Clinic, and already making a tremendous impact in our community, and we're delighted to welcome you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Hi. Okay, so one of my first days talking with students here in the Community Economic Development Clinic, one of the students looked at me and they said, wait, I think we all have to be property lawyers.
Yes.
And it's kind of true, because nothing happens without a place, right? Nothing happens at all, not even the internet, without a place to park the thing that is going to make it possible for something to actually happen for the community we want to serve, whoever that is. So understanding the structure of the city, understanding the structure of property in the city, of the way that our legal system has parsed urban space and all space that people interact with is a key to doing any kind of community work, any kind of development work, and certainly any kind of economic work. And I'm going to keep us really grounded. Remember, you were invited here for something called a talk-through. What is that? It's sort of like a walk-through. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you some stories about specific places, about specific campaigns, grounded. If anybody has a question, actually just raise your hand, because it's just me. I don't need to save time for anybody else. I put a presentation together that I think makes sense, but also with the idea that we had an hour and a half that I could torture you through, and that is a lot. So if you're like, wait, what did you just say? Just do it. So, this is New York City. So is this. And so is this. And in fact, these two places are the same place, with about 2 years in between them. That place was hidden here. This is the New York City Open Data Portal. New York City has what it says is the most progressive data policy of any city in the world. We are very, very good at putting spreadsheets on the internet. That is something that we think we're number one at. And we might be number one at putting spreadsheets on the internet. Putting spreadsheets on the internet does not necessarily mean that we're actually providing communities with the information they need to understand what's happening in their neighborhoods. But the New York City Open Data Portal does contain helpful things like lists of all of the parcels that the city of New York owns. And those parcels out in the world look like this. And a city employee might tell you that these two tools are both very, very clear. This is obviously a sign that was put up by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. It tells you that this land is publicly owned and that the agency that has been assigned to stewarding this land is actually taking care of it. They are making sure that it does not become a site of dumping. Of course, walking by this sign or living next door, you don't see that. You need a little bit of translation. So all of that is actually here and here. But in order to make it understandable to people who live in a neighborhood, it takes a couple of acts of actual, well, translation, for real, just like translating to any language. And what we had to do in order to make sure that the signs that we were putting up in the places in New York City were actually telling people what they needed to know about their neighborhoods, we had to make ourselves a tool, a sort of decoder ring for all of the data and information that's available about New York City. So I'm the founding director of a small not-for-profit organization that was started out of sheer frustration. Out of sheer frustration with a narrative of scarcity that permeated the real estate market and that permeated all talk of space in the years that Mayor Michael Bloomberg was mayor in New York City, and we advertised ourselves as the real estate capital of the world, while the neighborhood I lived in, which is Bed-Stuy, continued to be full of holes, or sometimes construction sites that started and stopped, where nothing was ever finished. So trying to get to the bottom of all the holes and start answering questions about where communities could take power, I started looking for information. And it was actually a connection through Brooklyn College's Center for the Study of Brooklyn, which is a very good idea that is no longer funded and no longer exists, that I found out about something called Map Bluto. It's heard of Map Bluto? Nope, nobody. Awesome. So Map Bluto, no, but close. What is it? What's Oasis?
I thought that was a project also not totally funded now. I know the city did not.
You're like, wait a second. Now that I've started asking these questions, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Like, where do they all come from? I'll tell you. So Map Bluto is actually a product that New York City's Department of City Planning makes. You guys have to forgive me a little bit. Okay. I don't have a cheat sheet, so we're all surprised together about what's coming next. So Map Bluto is a product the Department of City Planning makes. They take all of the parcel shape files that Department of Finance spits out, which are files that tell you what shape every single property actually is, and connect those shapes with all of the other information that's available about property. So for every single parcel, its zoning, its current use, its block and lot number, which is something we'll come back to in a little bit, every actual piece of information, piece of data that can be found. And for 15 years or so, Department of City Planning, which is part of New York City, said that Map Bluto, this product that they made out of 2 municipal databases, was proprietary. And in order to use it, you had to pay them a licensing fee. And that licensing fee for the city as a whole was $1,500 every 6 months, if you wanted accurate data. So that $3,000 a year is nothing for a large developer who's looking for sites to potentially build luxury housing. But it is a huge expense for community-based organizations that are trying to figure out what's up with those, right? And the information's out there and actually being regularly updated and regularly published. But up until 2011, it was hidden behind a paywall. Map Bluto is being used by the good folks at the CUNY Graduate Center for mapping, is what the organization is called, that creates this map called OASIS, which is the map of everything that matters in New York City. And they build it on Map Bluto. But in 2010, they were so frustrated at having to pay this $3,000 a year licensing fee to Department of City Planning that they stopped updating their data. And right around then is when the Center for the Study of Brooklyn let a copy of this data fall into my hands. And I realized that there was no accurate place for people in New York City could actually answer the question of where is our land and what's going on with land in their own neighborhoods. As a side project, between 2011 and 2014, I actually worked with the folks at the CUNY Graduate Center for Mapping to go after city planning pretty hard and get rid of the fee requirement and actually the licensing scheme. And now you can download Map Bluto from City Planning's website. We did that because actually it turns out all city documents, even databases, are accessible to the public via the Freedom of Information Law. And there's a lot of people who you can motivate to write a letter to City Planning asking for a copy of something they can only send you on 5 CD-ROMs in a particular week. We leveraged a couple of graduate programs, and 1 month City Planning was just swamped. 1 month City Planning was just swamped with requests. And we, in parallel with that, we ran a pretty aggressive press campaign, really pointing out that this licensing fee was egregious and that it was targeting communities and keeping information from people who really needed it in order to do work on the ground. That's what footnote. But that information is what we needed in order to build our decoder ring for understanding where vacant lots are in New York City. And understanding not only where vacant lots are, but where publicly owned vacant lots are. The ones that are part of our public inventory and therefore ones that we actually have some leverage over as residents. And it turns out that's where they are, approximately. And building this decoder ring for ourselves let us put up signs like this. It's really dark over here, but which were seen by people in communities, and were seen by New Yorkers who were hungry to make change, and hungry to stop living next door to places that were collecting garbage, that were collecting activity that nobody wanted to welcome in their neighborhoods, that were becoming sites where people dealt drugs, sites where animals lived, places that were just very, very frustrating and very, very stuck. And I'm actually going to let a couple of real life humans who were captured on tape speak to you for a moment. So this was the best that we could do with the technology. Oh. Huh. I tested it and it played. And then that guy left. And it was like, okay, see ya. It's got the screen.
So I'm going to check the computer volume.
That's the desktop.
Desktop.
But it worked 15 minutes ago. They're going to say, we couldn't figure this out for years. It was really scary. Not joking. Try again.
There we go.
I just needed you. You were in.
I live in City Line, East New York. I've been living in the same community for since 1982, which is almost 30 years.
My name is Pastor Timothy Olatukun. I live at 315 Beach 92nd Street, Rockaway Beach. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for about 18 years, and I'm a business owner.
My name is Kristen Bernardi-Rapp. I work as a freelance writer, and I live here in the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy. I am one of the founders of The Garden, along with Tia.
So my name is Shatia Jackson, and now I'm a struther. I recently got married.
Before The Garden was started, there was nothing here.
You know, we don't know who that land belonged to. That's the missing information, because we have been trying to get in touch with everybody, calling them, send them a message, and nobody reply us.
There's an empty lot, nobody cares. A lot of people fear to go in because they don't know what to do and they might get arrested or doing anything, even myself.
Vacant lots have just been around all the time. But I don't think it has been something that people thought they could change until recently.
Community lots and the community work, that makes us interact. That's how we becoming friends. And I think it's a good thing, and that's the way it should be, neighborhood should be going right now.
The community is for the people.
So as you might have noticed in the video, one of the things that the tool allows us to do is actually make sure we get the right information to the right place. But it also allows us to share, somewhat radically, information about who the actual decision makers inside the city agencies are that are in charge of these particular parcels. We're not targeting the people who we think have done something wrong. We're targeting the person who's got this file sitting on their desk. We really want people to be able to pick up the phone and call someone and say, hey, I live here, do you know what's happening here? And have a pretty good chance of connecting with someone who'll be able to tell them. Since New York City has adopted the black box strategy of 311, it has been harder and harder to actually reach people who make decisions for our built environment. And so, in some ways, all we're really doing is trying to unravel some of the 311 contract and some of that outsourcing that has gone, I think, outside of the city. I'm not sure where those operators are, but they're certainly not inside city government. They are customer service agents who pick up the phone when you call 311. They will route your call and they're relatively well trained, but they are not the person who you can call who can tell you specific information about a specific property. And when you are a person who lives in a neighborhood that has an asset like this, you need to be encouraged by actually reaching the right person pretty early on in a campaign to make change. Our campaigns to make change start with signs on fences, and they start with an online tool that lets us get these signs to the right fences. But they very quickly lead people to each other. We outline a campaign as quickly as we can that suggests lots and lots of ways for people to connect with their neighbors, to connect with local churches, to find block associations, to share their vision, to build an identity and build a shared dream that they can then advocate for, with the idea that together they will actually get access to this space and be able to make a transformation that is felt deeply by everybody who lives nearby. The American Community Survey says New York City has about 1,000 people living per block. That makes sense. Square block. So every time one of these spaces transforms from this to this, at least 1,000 lives get better. This is a zoom in of the tool that I showed you. And this shows you, this is the middle of Weeksville. And what we're looking at is the green is vacant public land, the pink is existing community spaces, and the yellow sunbursts surround places where people are actively organizing. They're actively getting together with their neighbors to create changes in their neighborhoods. So what you'll see in the top right, is a pink burst with a yellow burst around it, and that is the Saratoga Farm. That is a vacant lot that we put signs on ourselves, where we facilitated the connection of people to that space. It was actually a social worker from a nearby school. You can also see there in the image, it's a little bit south of the Saratoga Farm, who saw the signs and started building his community around creating the transformation. And in order to help him manage that, we also have a tool our tool continues past the moment of sharing information to become an organizing platform. So it shares information about each particular property that you need to get started, particularly the block and lot number, which is how everybody down in City Hall thinks about property. They're not looking at addresses, and which agency actually has this piece of property in its jurisdiction. From there, we go to a particular page for each property where we've curated the information we think you need to get started. So the block and lot number, image, something about the area of the space, and the political boundaries. So who represents this area? The real basics of who represents this area, the council member and the community board. Because those are the officials in New York City who actually have the most direct control over land use decisions and whose support you'll really need if you're going to try to transform a city-owned space into something else, into something other than what it is now. We try to be as transparent as we can be, so we explain where each parcel came from. Particularly, we link back to the data. Now that Map Bluto is open, we can say that we're using it. There was a moment there in time where we were using Map Bluto, but then had to figure out a way where we could reverse engineer it. Or if we knew what the answer was, we could probably find it in other databases if we knew what we were looking for. So we had to write very complicated explanations for how we were actually figuring out where vacant municipal land was without violating anybody's license to use the public data that was behind the paywall. This is the footnote, right? We're learning about Map Bluto in the footnotes of today's conversation. I'm going to try to share contact information for the folks who work at the agencies. What you see here is actually a really tough decision we had to make. Ms. Zhang, she's great. She's so responsive. She answers every call and every email within 24 hours. She called us one day and said, you know, I'm getting so many calls. Can I get my work done? And we said, okay, well, what can we do about that? And she said, can you please take my phone number down? And we said, we don't know. We had to really think about it. And she promised us that she would respond to one email a week from us if we sent it on Monday, addressing all of our questions, as long as we took her number off of the public website. So we did it. But it's a tricky situation where as you're building power and becoming an intermediary that's sharing power with the community, sometimes you yourself become a gatekeeper. And it was a really tricky situation, and I think she understands that if she stops answering us, then her phone number will go back on the website. So we sort of have this funny relationship with her. This is the only place where we made this decision, and so far it's been working, but it feels very strange to realize how much institutional power really congeals quickly to disempower people in neighborhoods, right? And so as long as we have staff and can maintain this relationship with Ms. Zhang, and as long as she stays happy and healthy, then this is great. The moment any of that changes, this is a mask that is no longer useful. Our goals are radical transparency and getting people to really engage with the information that's available, and a lot of times that actually means just bringing a computer to wherever you are. Bringing it to the Bengali Coffee Shop in East New York, bringing it to El Puente's Youth Center in East Williamsburg. Both the folks there have actually created new community spaces in their own neighborhoods since those pictures were taken. One's on Grand Street in Williamsburg, and the other is in East New York on top of the subway tunnel. I'll show you some specifics in a moment. But then when we start looking into the data, we also start looking into history, right? The land has been here whole time that New York City has been here. And in fact, the land has been here long before New York City has been here. And different conceptions of how this land can be owned, how it can be used, how it should be parceled, used, reused, have been actually applied to the same square inches of ground and water. But one of the things that we discovered when we started looking into other data sets is that many of the vacant lots in our neighborhoods are vacant because they landed in the wrong agency's archives, the wrong agency's jurisdiction. So this vacant lot was vacant for 20 years after City Council adopted an urban renewal area plan via legislation. And in that plan, this lot was to be open space to counterbalance the development of new housing on Williamsburg's south side. But the thing is, housing preservation and development is our urban renewal receiver agency. And they pay lots and lots and lots of people to work on developing housing projects. And they pay no people at all to work on developing open space projects. And so this piece of land simply sat in their inventory for 20 years. Housing had no motivation to do anything with it, since it was never going to give them any units. And that the way they know they're doing a good job is units. And no other agency knew that it was there. It had been assigned to housing. So it took actually a phone call to the person who had Ms. Zhang's job before her, the week before he retired, which was a lucky call, where the last thing he said to me was, look in the urban renewal plan. And I said, excuse me, what are you talking about? And so I looked in the urban renewal plan. When I had asked him, what are the plans for this lot? I know it's in your inventory. And he said, you'll find out, look in the urban renewal plan. And so that was a clue that actually led to the transformation of this space 20 years after it had been planned as an open space. The neighbors still had to organize, they still had to put together a proposal, they still had to get political support, they had to lobby for this like it was their idea, which felt a little bit offensive, but that's whatever, here we are. And this is just one success story out of many, and I thought, hey, Portuguese, in case you're feeling sleepy. We've helped 35 groups create new spaces, and 28 of them have actually been moved over to the inventory of the Parks Department for permanent preservation as gardens. That designation of something being in the Parks Department is crucial because it triggers state law. New York City public trust doctrine actually protects open space in cities because the state of New York recognized in the 1890s that when 14,000 people were living on a single block on the Lower East Side, I wish that number is insane, but it's true. Open spaces in the city were crucial. They were crucial to people's health. They were crucial to the survival of people in the city. And so the state courts started recognizing the right to open space as something protected by public trust. Other states have much more narrow conceptions of what is covered by public trust doctrine. It tends to apply to air and water. But New York State recognizes that open space and parks and dense cities are actually just as important as air and water, and applies a high level of scrutiny and requires a lot of process before open space in the city can be taken away. It can be taken away, but the state needs to approve it. The doctrine goes two ways. Something can be dedicated as parkland, and then the answer is simple. Do you need to ask Albany for permission to transform it? Yes. Or something can become parkland through implication. And that really means use. That really means, has something been acting like a park for so long and been treated like a park for so long by the city that everybody in the neighborhood relies on it and believes that they live next door to a park. So getting 28 formerly vacant lots transferred to the jurisdiction of the New York City Parks Department is a big step towards actually expanding the amount of space in the city that is protected under state law. It's an open question, actually, in the law, whether that jurisdictional designation is enough for for implied dedication to kick in, but it's a pretty good argument, and it's still open. Some people ask, but how do people pay for this stuff? How do you take all of that nasty, the hypodermic needles and the dead cats, and people have told me they found guns more times than I can count. But how do you take all of that and turn it into something lovely? Well, it turns out here in the city of New York, there is a robust infrastructure for the greening of New York City. There are lots of organizations that just want to green something. They want to be able to take a before picture and an after picture, and then maybe some smiling kids in the middle, right? And that's something that there's just lots of money for. But what they don't want to do is figure out where to do that, because then you're getting into a very messy territory where we all have to be property lawyers. So the trick is to take these community-based organizations and make sure that they know who to ask as soon as they have a lease or a license or a place that is newly transferred to the Parks Department that can be built out as a park. And it works basically every time. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back to talking about the data, because actually this is what takes us in a few different directions. So when we first got access to the city's data of vacant municipal land, a lot of people said, oh no, that doesn't mean anything. That's just a spreadsheet. The city doesn't have land. New York City doesn't have any vacant land. I live in Park Slope, there aren't vacant lots in my neighborhood. I live in Midtown, there aren't vacant lots in my neighborhood. Well, when you just draw a map of everything that is in that spreadsheet that is filtered by vacant and city owned, it looks like this. And you think, yeah, you might be right. This whole thing might be some kind of error. And then you realize that the city data actually puts little tiny slivers that are maybe 2 inches wide and run the whole length of a block, or little corners of a lot that are remnants of an old lot pattern that doesn't exist anymore. Puts those in the same spreadsheets as those lots that I just showed you pictures of, as real places of potential. So the first thing we had to do to actually make sense of this was to take out the noise. Take out everything that wasn't actually a lot. And what we saw is that actually vacant public land in New York City is concentrated in particular neighborhoods. And it's not surprising, but it does lead to ask the next question, and the next question is why. And so to answer why, we actually have to look backwards. And we have to look very directly at a history of city planning and of the distribution of things in the city based on race, based on class, based on immigration status that has actually played out on the landscape of the city. So here again are vacant lots and gardens. This is today. The pink ones are gardens, so cheer for all those people. We'll just do a little review. Here we are in the middle of Weeksville, lots of those things. And let's go to South Brooklyn, looks like the suburbs, and somehow they forgot to bulldoze it. This map bears a lot of relation. I'm going to do that slowly one more time for you guys. This map, which is today, there's a lot of relation to these maps. These maps are actually maps of dollars that were spent by the federal government to pay people who owned bulldozers to come and demolish buildings in neighborhoods in New York City that members of what was then called the Slum Clearance Commission, that is now called Housing Preservation and Development, called blighted. And just gonna do some close-up comparison for you guys. It turns out that the places where vacant lots and gardens are today are actually the same places that the bulldozers came between 1949 and 1968, when the federal government was funding the demolition phase of urban renewal planning. And this is Manhattan. And as you see, the Lower East Side and East Harlem are those places. And right now, those are places where gardens thrive, where communities 50 years after that act of destruction have taken their neighborhoods back and created something beautiful out of them. And this is Brooklyn. And this is actually what it looks like on the ground. That's the middle of Brownsville. It's one of our gang putting up a sign. But this was the plan. This little chart on the bottom, that's taken out of an atlas that Housing Preservation and Development very proudly published in 1968, being very transparent about the great progress they were making in the urban renewal program. The program was meant to come in 4 phases: acquisition, relocation, demolition, and then construction. And in fact, where we are today is one of the premier places where this happened. This building stands in a neighborhood that was a primarily Black and Puerto Rican community whose property was acquired, people were relocated, the buildings were demolished, and construction actually happened. Right? We got Lincoln Center through the Lincoln Center Urban Renewal Plan. But that cycle only played itself out in places where the market was interested, and in places where there was a lot of inducement, actually, for the financiers who paid for these projects to go forward. And in places like Brownsville, that were actually demolished with the same federal dollars at the same time, communities are still waiting for construction to start. And so they're taking some of that into their own hands. Since we are in a law school. Sounds crazy, right? That cities are going around spending federal dollars, demolishing people's homes, acquiring property that belongs to families. But in fact, this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court the same year that the Supreme Court found school segregation unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. If you want the citation, get it from me. But the case went up to the Supreme Court, and it was a Black grocery store owner in Washington, D.C., whose neighborhood had a vacancy rate of 2%, meaning every single storefront and apartment in the neighborhood was full, except maybe once in a while someone's lease would end. And the municipality of Washington, D.C. called his neighborhood blighted. They wanted space. They wanted space for a convention center, in fact. And he took his challenge to the eminent domain taking that urban renewal allowed to the Supreme Court. Washington, D.C. is an opportune place to do that and get to go to the Supreme Court pretty quickly. The Supreme Court said it was fine. It was fine. It was not going to get involved in decisions municipalities were making, determining what neighborhoods were blighted and which ones weren't. And the evidence in that case was overwhelming, that neighborhoods where property was owned by people of color, where property was owned by immigrants, were disproportionately being identified as blighted neighborhoods by city planners in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court simply declined to get involved. And at the same time, it declared segregation in education unconstitutional. Those 2 decisions coming from the same court in the same year actually have led to segregated schools. We know this in New York, and we know this in New York City, and we know this in every city in the country. That's a different talk, but this is the context, right? And the whole idea of urban renewal was actually to get that federal money, right? To get the money that paid for the bulldozers, because that was going to be jobs, and then the construction jobs that followed after that, and jobs for a particular kind of worker. The architect of urban renewal here in New York City is someone we all know maybe a little too well, is Robert Moses, But he was a bit brilliant. He was incredibly strategic in his allocation of his volunteer time. He volunteered to chair the Slum Clearance Commission when it was just being formed, and actually developed the mechanism through which New York City was able to receive federal dollars for the first 3 phases of urban renewal. He knew that with the inducement of large parcels of land that would be put together and made available as development sites for places like Lincoln Center, there would be an interest by the private development community to move that forward. Federal government realized by 1974 that this was working out terribly for cities and actually closed the program. The City of New York didn't miss a beat. Since 1974, the City of New York has adopted 82 new urban renewal plans. And I've drawn a little map there. I'll show you how we did this. Those are the ones that the City of New York adopted after federal funding dried up. What the urban renewal plan area designation does is it fulfills the public purpose requirement of the Fifth Amendment. Private property may be taken for public purpose for just compensation. And the public purpose requirement simply says there has to be a good reason that you're doing this. And the urban renewal plan designation checks the box of the reason. And the reason is blight. Blight is an analogy borrowed from the plant world. It is a disease that tomatoes get. It is actually, that is something very specific that it is. And it can spread from plant to plant to plant and ruin your whole garden. And that analogy was something that was used by the real estate industry in the 1930s and 40s to scare property owners into thinking, if we don't do something about this blight thing in our neighborhoods, it too will spread from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood and ruin the entire city. But in fact, parcels of land, buildings, and lots, and neighborhoods, and the people who live in neighborhoods, they don't get blight. That's a disease tomatoes get. There is nothing in that analogy that actually helps us think about how development happens in cities. But there's a lot in that analogies that help policing regimes like broken windows theory move forward, despite there being no data that it works. But so New York City, in the service of eliminating blight, has actually continued to adopt urban renewal plan areas. The latest one was adopted in 2008 for Willets Point in Queens. When an urban renewal plan area is adopted, the city then has the power to take any private property in the area that has been designated without having to explain the purpose. Purpose is taken care of by simply saying we are eliminating blight. No one needs to say we are eliminating blight and building a parking lot. The law doesn't ask what you're going to do next. Oh yeah, data. So the thing is, I showed you those books. Housing Preservation and Development published an atlas in 1968. They really thought they were doing the right thing. The same guy who published the atlas in 1968 as an intern did it again in 1984. His name is Nathan Segal. He died. And since 1984, these plans have been sitting in HPD's offices, and they've been determining the fate of property owners around the city, but nobody's had access to them except one at a time. And no comprehensive atlas of urban renewal planning exists for New York City after 1984. And so knowing that that parcel in South Williamsburg had somehow been forgotten as a planned open space, as a planned park, although it had been written into an urban renewal plan area, I thought we should look at those. We should try to figure out what's going on citywide. And so I wrote a Freedom of Information Law request. Since we know these are documents, we can have access to them. And I spent about a year and a half arguing with HPD about whether or not we had to pay 25 cents a copy to get access to about 4,000 pages of documents, which would have been more money than we had. Which actually, when I think about it, it's not really that much money. But it was way more money than we had. And so instead, I actually convinced them that under the law, we're allowed to inspect these documents, even if we can't afford to copy them. And so for 2 years, a team of volunteers, rotating team of volunteers, went to Housing Preservation and Development's offices and turned these documents into these spreadsheets. And these spreadsheets that are actually information for every single block and lot that has been included in any urban renewal plan area adopted by the city of New York from 1949 to the end of last year. And we created an updated and first ever citywide atlas of urban renewal planning for the city of New York. We printed a map. We did it as part of an intervention at the Queens Museum, but more importantly, and when we first did this, and I first saw the map, I actually screamed. Because the map looks so much like the map that we already know. The map of vacant lots and gardens in New York City. It's not just a feeling, this is what the data has actually bore out. We tried to be as transparent about this as possible. This is a map that you can access on the internet. You can filter by planned uses. There are plenty of other open spaces that have not been created. Some of them were quite large parks, as you can see up there in Flushing. We really, where information is available, tried to pull in everything we could. This was done manually. But what you see there is the entry for what is now the Keithforth Community Garden. That lot whose sign I showed you a few slides ago. And they're in fact, in that same neighborhood, the other planned open space that was supposed to be built as part of the South Side Urban Renewal Plan, it also wasn't built. They've both been vacant lots since the 1980s at least, and have been vacant lots waiting to become open space since the plan was adopted in 1992. This site is right now being transferred from Housing Preservation and Development to the Parks Department. I got confirmation yesterday. There it is. One of the things that we were able to do once we had the data is actually integrate it into our organizing tool, into the platform that helps people actually create new sites and find one another. And so the fact that this is planned open space is now information that's much more easy to find. Oh yeah, great. How's everybody okay? Yeah? Burning questions? All right, so this is today, right? So we're getting used to this map. This is the today. Yeah, that's a good idea. So everyone should join Brian for a moment. Maybe I'll also get some water. I'll breathe for a moment, because that was heavy. We have time. We're playing a very particular kind of game. There's the other presentation. Wait, you know what? We're playing a really particular kind of game. Will you ask that question, like where everyone can hear you, because it's a good question. I can just repeat it.
Okay.
I don't need it. You don't. I can ask. Oh, yeah. So first of all, some entities that we think of as public think of themselves as private, like the MTA and NYCHA. So there's no reason. Okay, you want to call yourself private, that's fine. But then there are actually a few very lucky places on here where somebody or a private property owner has reached out to us and said, I own this lot and I would love to see it turned into a garden. Can you find me some people who want to do that? We'll add that too.
Are you kidding?
But mostly it's MTA and NYCHA. And I've been very schooled by their lawyers. They say they're private. Okay. They can be whatever they want to be as long as they're willing to cooperate.
We probably issue bonds.
I'll let it. Yeah.
So, is there a history of the term blight that goes before the 1930s response to?
It was literally, there's a fantastic article, shoot me an email, I'll send it to you, that actually traces the history. And there's literally a real estate industry publication from the 1930s where somebody has this brilliant idea of using this analogy. Yeah. Before that, plants, tomatoes, in fact, very specific.
Are you going to try to integrate the urban renewal map into or
That is a Steve question. You know Steve probably. You talk to Steve.
No, I don't.
Oh, he's the guy who into Map Bluto. I thought you meant Oasis. No, the city is not interested in integrating anything into Map Bluto. And all of our data is open data, and we keep offering to give them a download of our data, which is much better than their data about vacant land, to put on the open data portal. They're also not interested in that. Yeah. So, whenever. You can remind them, it's downloadable. You can like download your own version and be like, hey, upload this. So somebody asked a good question that I think is worth digging into before we do this next part. And this next part is I'm warning you, a little bit of whiplash. We're going to do a lot of maps. We're going to do a little bit of time travel. And then we're actually going to talk through community spaces in New York City, like specific ones. I know, right? I teased you. You're like, wait, I thought we were talking about gardens. We just spent an hour on urban renewal. Sorry. So really good question was the connection between the Davis versus Washington, D.C. and Brown versus Board of Education. The connection between those two cases. How is it that despite a ruling that school segregation is itself unconstitutional, that schools became more segregated? And the answer is neighborhoods became more segregated. And most schools in the United States are neighborhood schools. Kids go to school where they live. Their eligibility for a school seat is based on their community district or their zip code. And so as urban renewal area planning moved forward and displaced certain communities, mostly Black communities and immigrant communities from certain neighborhoods, and forced disinvestment in those same neighborhoods, driving property values down and making it possible for people who are of lesser means and could afford to pay less in their housing to actually concentrate in neighborhoods with the worst housing stock in the city. Segregation in neighborhoods got much, much worse. Does that answer your question enough that I can go forward? Because we'll be back. We're actually going to talk about redlining before we get to the gardens. Anyway. So that's today. It's so nice. And we're just going to do a little bit of a little time travel. So the neighborhoods with the lots and gardens, they're the same places that 10 years ago were the middle of the subprime lending crisis. Oh. Just to zoom in on that, these are places where banks gave out high-cost loans with ballooning payments, where loans were made available to people who had no income, where brokers took their fees, which they earned for the simple act of completing a transaction, regardless of whether the person who took out the debt against their property actually had the ability to pay. Okay, we know this story. If you don't know this story, there's a great movie right now called The Big Short. Go see it. It's fabulous. But these are the same neighborhoods in New York City. And when you look at where the tax lien sale has been most impactful, which has been our strategy for collecting municipal debt since 1996. You're looking, again, at a map of the same neighborhoods. Particularly appreciate this map created by John Liu when he was comptroller, because it really doesn't show you just the concentrations. It's very clear that these are Black and brown communities. These are Black and Hispanic communities. They're being targeted by the sale of tax debt is owed against their properties to speculative bondsmen who take the $3,000 you didn't pay in your back taxes last year, probably because you just paid off your mortgage and your bank has been paying your taxes the whole time and you didn't know there was this other bill because it's been going to the bank. Well, what New York City does with that debt when you don't pay it is actually sell it to somebody who has the statutory right to charge 18% interest compounded daily and add fees. And those people, when you don't pay, also then have the right to foreclose. Yes.
Are we seeing the same pattern with the recent deed fraud problem?
No, but the deed fraud stuff is really hard to track. So on the one hand, yes, I just saw a map that, actually I meant to change my answer. Yes, but not in the reporting. So it's deed theft is it's a crime, and it's a crime that usually goes unpunished. This is not a crime, this is a policy, right? The data's out there. But crimes tend to go punished where they are reported. And the data about criminal activity is really only available after somebody's been indicted. So we're not seeing the data around deed theft really show us the picture that we know exists on the ground, which is, of course, these are the most vulnerable neighborhoods. Of course, these are the most vulnerable communities. But are they the ones that are reporting deed theft? No. And so going backwards into the urban renewal era, we're again looking at the same neighborhoods. And we can take one more step back in time and actually look at the neighborhoods that the Homeowners Loan Corporation declared safe for investing in. And in that declaration said that they would insure mortgages given on house purchase or mortgages given for renovation of homes in these areas. And in areas that they colored red, they said that their investments were just too risky for them to insure. And so, in the 1930s, it was impossible to get a mortgage if you owned property in any one of these same neighborhoods. If your neighborhood was colored red on this map, the banks would not loan to you because they were afraid that if you didn't pay, there was no backup plan. In the places that are colored yellow and blue, the federal government would still insure those mortgages and would still buy the note against your home if you didn't pay. But in the places that were colored red, the word from the federal insurers was invest at your own risk. And the mortgage industry was conservative enough at that time not to take that risk. This is Brooklyn. This is a very split map of Manhattan. If someone wants to put that back together for me, I would love that. But this is a little abstract, but the one on your left is lower Manhattan, the one on your right is upper Manhattan. This is Brooklyn, this is the Bronx. And put back together, the redlining maps actually foreshadow everything that is to come. Now, all of the ways that land use decisions made through the last 100 years, and these are land use decisions that are being made with race at their center. These are the decisions that have led to these communities being the centers of community-led action and opportunity for community-led action in the present. And what I didn't say about the insurance maps is that if your neighborhood had 5% or more of people of color, it was considered a red neighborhood. 5%. I just really want you to think about that. In the 1930s, the folks who were evaluating risk decided that what made neighborhoods the least risky was homogeneity. They thought if people live around people who are just like them, then they'll stay. And they'll pay their mortgages, and there'll be some kind of social cohesion that makes them accountable to each other and to society. And we know, since we all actually choose to live here in New York City, because of the vibrancy, because of the vitality, and because of the diversity of the city, that they were wrong. But what they thought was a safe investment was homogeneous communities in the suburbs. And the underwriting reflected that. And of course was racist. But it was a racism that was grounded in an ideology that was about social cohesion. And so that 5% that would make your neighborhood so risky, no one would ever say it's because, when you have 5 black families on a block with 95 white families, those black families are going to do something terrible. They would say, oh, that doesn't feel cohesive. I'm not sure that these pieces go together. And so some neighborhoods were colored red. And so if you owned property in one of those neighborhoods, taking out a mortgage so you could fix your roof would be impossible. And that disinvestment brings us to the present. Remember housing preservation and development? Who remembers what they used to be called? Yeah, they were actually the Slum Clearance Commission. Same same files. They sound better now. But they were the Slum Clearance Commission, and more than half of the city's inventory of land with no buildings on it is still, to this day, in the inventory of housing preservation and development. That's the one that's actually just getting transferred right now. And this was very late at night, but that worked. People saw the sign, they got together, they created a plan, they got letters of support from the same organizations that are still active in their neighborhoods that helped craft the plan in the first place. Los and a local daycare that's based out of a church called the Nuestros Niños on the south side. They had to start over, in a way, but finally, this planned open space is becoming a reality. And so, I'm going to talk through some actual places. Beach 45th Street Community Farm was where we started. Lovely afternoon shot. Also in the center of an urban renewal plan area, the largest in the city, where there's still 81 acres of city-owned vacant land in the inventory of housing preservation and development. And now it looks like this. We all remember, right? We started here. Anybody ever heard of the Institute for Applied Autonomy? Did anybody participate in protests against the Republican National Convention in New York City in 2004? Were you on one of those text message loops that would tell you where people were? Well, we don't know who those people are, but they are the people behind that, which is brilliant. This is 462 Halsey Community Garden. It was in a vacant lot in the inventory of housing preservation and development for about 40 years before Kristen and Tia and their neighbors, who you saw in the video about an hour ago, actually transformed it into a garden. And then the beginning of last year, the beginning of last year, our brand new mayor put out a list of sites that were available for $1 to purchase by anybody who wanted to develop anything called affordable housing. Didn't matter if you were a for-profit developer or a nonprofit developer. Remember, our whole urban renewal scheme is actually looking for for-profit developers, is looking for money and money makers to build the city. So anybody who would be willing to build something called affordable housing that would cost the people who lived in it up to $3,200 a month for a family of 4, because hey, New York City seems to be wedded to the idea of using federal guidelines for determining what the area median income is. Now, the federal guidelines make a lot of sense. If you need to come up with a formula that makes sense for every city in the nation, you say, hey, we're going to take the city and its suburbs, the ones that are within 50 miles or so in the state, right? We're not going to reach across the river to whatever you've got over there, but in the state. We're going to take all those people, we're going to average their income. That might work great in Rhode Island, right? But in New York City, what it gets us is an area median income that is inflated by the wealthiest counties in the country that surround the city. So when we talk about what the area median income is for New Yorkers, we as people who live in New York City, on average only make 80% of it. And that includes the people who live on the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side. That actually includes the richest New Yorkers. We don't even on average make 100% of our own area median income. And so we end up with these ridiculous situations where a vacant lot that was transformed by its neighbors into the vibrant space that you saw in the video earlier is then offered to developers as an inducement for constructing housing that they can then charge up to $3,200 a month for. And we're supposed to celebrate. These gardeners decided to, these gardeners organized instead. What I actually had to do when that request for proposals came out to the development community was go through something called an addendum. That actually included the list of properties that were being offered for $1, and it turned out that there were 20 active community gardens that were being offered on a list of about 180 supposedly vacant city-owned properties for developers to build this kind of affordable housing on. And 462 Halsey was one of them. And when I called them to let them know, they got organized. They did a monthly letter writing campaign to the mayor. They showed up at every single rally and protest that housing advocates organized all last year, because they wanted to be clear that they were not anti-affordable housing, and that they would actually be willing to let their garden go if it meant that people in their community who were being displaced and kicked out could actually afford to stay. But that's not what was on offer. So they decided that they were not for sale. As of December 30th, 2015, they have been transferred to the New York City Parks Department. And so what they have been doing is growing in the beds that you see on your, that way, those ones, which were starting to fall apart. And on the occasion of being transferred to the Public Parks Department, they bought all new wood, and they're rebuilding the farm. It is a community farm, and it's operated as one in the middle of Bed-Stuy. This is the fast part. I'm just going to keep going. We're going to go to the Lower East Side, where this lovely family has owned this 18-foot strip adjoining 2 city-owned parcels for about 40 years. They bought it for $5,000, hoping that someday they might get the city-owned properties as well. It's the Gottlieb family. If you know anything about the Lower East Side, they actually own a lot of these, and they use them as leverage to get free city property, for $1, free city property, to actually consolidate large development sites. And so back in 2012, before we worked in Manhattan, I got a frantic phone call from someone who lives here, actually whose windows are right there, who said, I think something is happening on the lots next to my house. And I said, you know, there's something happening on the lots next to a lot of people's houses. that's, you know, that's nice, maybe go check with your community board about what's going on. And what she uncovered was that there was this plan, that the owners of the tiny strip had a plan to actually acquire, the city-owned properties to build, as they say here, 14 units, luxury housing. 3 of them are going to be affordable, and those 3 units are going to be a give back in exchange for about 200 square feet of buildable R6 zoned free city land. The neighbors got organized, we put signs on those fences, we hosted a couple of meetings, we helped neighbors connect with one another when they saw the signs, and they started organizing. They started clearing the lot, they got permission to actually use the space in the interim while the larger plans were being figured out. They cleared it out themselves, they invited artists to come and draw a different kind of attention to the space, and they actually didn't do much building before they had their first party, because they wanted to know who was gonna come out, who was this space gonna be important to. And they figured out at their first party that there were a lot of people who lived in their neighborhood who got around using wheelchairs. So they designed their garden after this party so that there would be an entrance on one side that was accessible to those people in the neighborhood. They partner with the local shul, they do really active programming there. They were really focused on making sure that people were in the space all the time, finding different kinds of value there, because they knew that they had an interim use license agreement from Housing Preservation and Development, the agency that is charged with producing housing units. And they knew that the developer's promise of building 3 affordable units actually probably didn't look that bad to the folks at Housing Preservation and Development. So they really stayed focused on organizing their community to make sure that that original promise, that original plan to give the city-owned land to a for-profit developer for luxury housing wouldn't come true. They attended their community board meetings with 1,000 supporters, they wrote petitions, and at the end of last year, when the gardens that were on the list to be as inducements for housing development, like 462 Halsey, when those ones were transferred to the Parks Department after an intense campaign that the 20 gardens that were actually on that list conducted, this garden was also transferred. This one, and actually 20 others. I know, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
What's the developer's reaction here?
Well, he only owns that 18-foot strip, so they're pretty bad, because now it's really not worth much. But if they could find someone who wants to buy it from them and build a tiny single-family house, they'd have a house in the middle of a garden. I don't know, but they still own it. And so the gardeners are actually trying to figure out if there's some way they can convince him to just donate it at that point. But and the truth is, the privately owned parcel divides the back of the garden. Should have let him happen. There's a place where they have to walk on that privately owned property to get from one side to the other. So it's not over, but it's gotten a lot more interesting. This is a story about the oldest land trusted garden in New York City. This garden was formed in 1980. It was an all-black block association in Crown Heights that actually articulated in their articles of incorporation that they were an all-black block association in Crown Heights, and it was very important to them that they were forming this corporation to own this land. They actually, they got some of it from the city for $1, and the rest they purchased. And they held on to it from 1980 until 2014. It's a gigantic parcel. It's a great development site. It also has these amazing trees. And in 2014, they discovered that they had not been doing their filings with the IRS and had lost their property tax exemption. I'm sorry, had lost their income tax exemption, which meant they lost their property tax exemption, which meant they were suddenly being billed property taxes, which they had never been billed before, and they were in arrears. And they were in the pipeline towards the tax lien sale. which would lead to a foreclosure. What they did first was have bake sales. They thought we could probably buy ourselves out of this hole. But eventually they got in touch with me and with the Brooklyn Queens Land Trust, which is a Gardner-led land trust that was formed out of the Giuliani crisis years when 112 gardens were actually saved off of the surplus real estate auction by gardeners and by advocates nationwide. And some of those gardens were actually purchased and put into a Gardner-led land trust. This was the second garden that was not part of that initial acquisition to actually join the trust. And this is the closing. And the folks on the, I'm gonna learn this, the folks on your right are actually original members who originally built the garden and were really happy to see it connected to an organization that is actually set up to make sure that those filings and exemptions stay current and actually hold the land in the long term. But I was their attorney, and I watched them go through almost a year of conversations where they almost didn't do this because they had set themselves out to be the first Black block association to own land in Brooklyn. And that was really, really important to some of the members. But instead they've joined, those members have joined the board of the Brooklyn Queens Land Trust, the new organization that now owns the land, which is pretty, oh yeah, didn't do that. Anyway, here's a sad story with a happy ending. 10 Neighbors Community Garden was actually a garden in the 1990s, and when I found it, it looked like this. Between the 1990s and 2012, it was placed on the surplus real estate auction by Mayor Rudy Giuliani in 1999. And when gardeners protested the auctioning of about 600 gardens by a city that owned about 14,000 parcels at the time, the issue was actually settled in a compromise. The Attorney General's office brought a lawsuit based on the public trust doctrine, based on the fact that these were the lungs of the neighborhood. And it seemed like the lawsuit was poised to end well for the gardeners. And so the city decided to negotiate, and a settlement was reached. And that settlement did not take every threatened garden off the list. A list of gardens were moved to the Parks Department. Another list was given to developers immediately. And then a middle list was kept, hold for development, it said on the spreadsheet. And this was one of the sites that was held for development. But from the ground, what actually happened is the garden was bulldozed. It was bulldozed in 2002, just weeks after the settlement was signed. And from 2002 to 2012, until I put signs on this lot and then found Carlos and his family who live on the block and actually know the neighbors, it was a vacant lot. Carlos started organizing in 2014, and we were actually able to uncover this history by talking to the neighbors and actually talking to the folks at the Parks Department who, when they applied to start a garden here, said, "You already have a garden." And we said, "Excuse me?" And then I said, "You know what? Just say yes." So we actually revived this garden completely from the ashes. We just used the old file that they had at Parks and said, yeah, okay, here's the new people that are gardening there now. And so this garden is open, and it was one of the ones that was finally preserved at the end of last year in that bundle of gardens that was explicitly transferred to the Parks Department. Some of the neighbors who were gardeners back in the 1990s were the folks that were displaced in 2002 are back, and they're cautiously gardening, and I need to go take some pictures of them. Right now, in fact, not every garden on that list of sites that are available for developers to build housing on for $1 has been saved. And so there are still gardens on the list that is on offer to for-profit or nonprofit housing developers. This is Pleasant Village in East Harlem. Pleasant Village is a garden in parts. when it was first created, the lot looked like this. This was East Harlem in the 1970s. And what you see in the blue there is property that is in the inventory of the Parks Department. But what is in the red has been offered for purchase to any developer who will build within affordability terms that I described earlier. And this place continues to be threatened. The gardeners are taking a really strong position that they are not for sale. This is the site where their chicken coop is, where their composting happens. It's a super vibrant space in the neighborhood, and this struggle continues. This is another one with a happy ending. This is a block association in Jamaica, Queens, that has actually owned this land since 1967. And they found out they had a problem when they received process in a foreclosure case. It turned out that the president of the block association, who had been the same person from 1967 until he passed away in 2010, had simply been paying the property taxes. No one had ever told them that there is something called a nonprofit tax exemption in New York City. They had never applied for it. Department of Finance had no record. And when he died in 2010, the bills stopped getting paid. And so we intervened when the foreclosure was already going, and it was actually in court. And all that we were able to do, since the bonded trust that purchases the debt is entitled to its interest and fees by statute, we couldn't do anything to reduce the amount of money that was actually owed, and the community had to raise about $30,000 to clear what had originally been about $5,500 in unpaid bills. The only thing I could do was get the lawyer for the bank to not take his fee. So that was a fee that he had some control over. Everything else is determined by statute. But look, they're closing. That parcel is now also owned by the Brooklyn Queens Land Trust, and there's going to be a grand opening on April 9th. So we should all go to Jamaica, Queens. And then the deed fraud garden. Who already knows this story? Ready for Brian. So, a long time ago, there was this really nice house in the middle of Prospect Lefferts. A lady named Germaine Curtin lived there with her husband, Oscar. They had bought the place in 1968. This is the deed for which they bought it. In 1968, you can see they were living at 368 Clifton Place. This is 368 Clifton Place. Oscar and Germaine Curtin were actually people who were displaced when their old neighborhood was declared an urban renewal plan area by City Council to make way for the construction of NYCHA housing, which was built at 368 Clifton Place 2 years after they moved. At the time, they were a family from Guyana. So they were a couple that married late in their lives. They were both in their second marriages, and they were displaced from Bed-Stuy at a time when people were being displaced from Bed-Stuy and from other neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy for the elimination of blight and the construction of new modern housing. In 1970, these new units would have gone to white families because the requirements for getting a unit in NYCHA were arranged in such a way that if you were a white family, a middle class white family, you were much more likely to meet the requirements. 1973, this actually became an integrated housing project. But in 1970, when it was built on the property that used to be Oscar and Germaine's house, it was most definitely a mostly white or all white project. Oscar and Germaine's house burned down in 1997. From 1997 to 2012, the vacant lot collected washing machines, cars, a gun, lots of rocks, dead toys, and all kinds of things that the people who lived on this block were really sick of living next to. They tried to figure out who the owners were and couldn't reach any living person. Germain died in 1990. And so they decided to take matters into their own hands and create the Maple Street Community Garden. This was the day they opened. There's this beautiful tree that some people say is about 70 years old and would have been in the backyard of the Curtin family home. And the garden existed unmolested for about 2 years until these guys showed up. These are Joseph and Michael McConney. They claim they own the place. They own the place under a limited liability company called Housing Urban Development LLC. It has absolutely nothing to do with any federal, state, or city agency. It's just a thing they incorporated. It has its own tax ID number. Luckily, by the time they showed up, the gardeners were ready for them, and so were the folks at the police precinct, who had been, let's say, sternly briefed by me to request a deed or actual eviction papers if anybody showed up at the property. And these guys had no paperwork with them. It turns out actually that this is just what the McConneys are up to in Brooklyn and Queens. I didn't bother mapping Manhattan. They incorporate things called Brooklyn LLC, Queens LLC, the Queens Organization LLC, Neighborhood Preservation LLC, HPD LLC, they got that one. And what they did with that one was give out subprime loans. It's like a really good joke. These are just their recent property transactions in just 2 boroughs. One of the brothers has been indicted for deed fraud. The other one has been indicted and convicted of fixing foreclosure auctions in the Queens County Courthouse. They claim they own this place. They claim they bought it from heirs of the Curtins in 2003. The thing is, Oscar and Germain married in their 60s. They had no children. There are names written on the deed that say the sole heirs and list 2 names, Alan and Alexander. There's one social security number on the closing papers. The district attorney's office actually looked up the person whose social security number that is. It's a man with a Spanish accent who lives in Brooklyn, but he has no idea who the Curtins are. And the other person has no social security number at all. But apparently, they purchased this deed in 2003 and deeded it over to Brooklyn LLC. In 2010, they moved it over to Housing Urban Development LLC, presumably thereby becoming a bona fide purchaser and washing their hands of whatever happened in that first transaction that might have been slightly improper. And then they tried to evict the garden. And their first attempt was through bullying and self-help. They were stopped by the police. Their second attempt was through the landlord-tenant court. Their process server did not do a good job of making sure the papers actually got to the gardeners or to anybody who represents the gardeners, and they actually were poised to lose that case and simply stopped pursuing it. So they did something even trickier. So that's us in court. That's what housing court looks like. This is where people lose their homes and their bodegas and everything that matters to them. That's what, it's like it happens somewhere, right? So then they succeeded in doing something really tricky. They filed something called a quiet title case. That is the kind of thing you file in the Supreme Court when somebody else is making a claim to your property and you want to extinguish it. Or if you have 6 brothers and sisters and your parents died without a will, and you've all agreed who's going to be the person who inherits the property, you might file a quiet title case and know that none of your siblings are going to appear, and then you'll get a nice clean deed at the end where the title has been quieted and it is yours. But what they did was file it against the Curtins, the dead people. You can't sue dead people. But the courts don't check. And it actually turns out that this is their business practice. when you start looking at those transactions and then looking up what's going on in the court files, this is a project someone could dig into. I scratched the surface. This works. You can totally get a fraudulent deed rubber stamped by the Supreme Court by filing a quiet title case, particularly against someone you know is too dead to show up or too fictional. They don't show up, the case gets decided on default, you get a nice clean deed. In the middle of that case, they managed to get a restraining order against the garden because they bamboozled the judge into thinking they actually had a proper claim. They wouldn't be filing a case to quiet title if they didn't have some kind of right to the property. So we're evicted here. We are not on the property in this picture here. There are about 4 weeks in which the gardeners were not allowed onto the property because there was a restraining order that was issued by the Supreme Court. We did some political action, and we also made sure that nobody entered the garden without cooperation from the local precinct, just starting to get the picture of what is going on here. But more importantly, we appealed the stupid restraining order and actually won. This is what it looks like when you need to tell people that they've won something. And so the garden is open. The case continues. It has gone back to the Supreme Court. The appeal has been resolved. The judge has called the deed dubious and actually assigned a guardian ad litem to represent the interests of the Curtin estate. That person is lovely, and we'll see what happens next. It's all very dramatic. Oh, there's one more piece to this presentation. It's all very dramatic, and while we are defending the gardener's right to be on this property, we are also working on the political side to make sure that this property actually becomes a public asset. And so we have been working with the Parks Department, the Borough President's Office, and City Council to encourage the city to actually acquire this property and in fact use eminent domain if they have to in order to acquire this lot for public purpose. So shouldn't have all bad feelings about eminent domain. It does have some nice words in there that we can use for our own ends, but it has this nasty history that we also need to be very aware of. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do on the criminal side against?
Me?
Or
Do I look like someone who can do anything?
I'm just saying, is there a potential for a criminal complaint against the Urban Development LLC, or you said there was ongoing?
So that's a job for the prosecutor or the district attorney, or the attorney general's office.
I'm not
They're
a
all
lawyer,
working
so
on
I
it.
can ask.
What?
I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
a lawyer, so I can ask bad legal questions.
No, they're all working on it, and they won't talk to each other, and no one will tell me what's going on. But every once in a while, I get very sternly interviewed, like I might have stolen the property. Like that's a thing that happens every couple of months. Like, really? Again? This is new. So hopefully they're working on it. I don't know. We're in process of sort of solving the vacant lot problem. But New York City also owns some of these things. These are all city-owned assets. They should be ours. They should be serving the public. But this is where they're heading if we do nothing. So what are we going to do? So we have started to build the infrastructure. I wonder what happens next. Oh yeah. We've started to build the infrastructure that will allow us to make a credible argument that the community can take over something like this and actually transform it into a useful asset. And that infrastructure involves building a real estate investment cooperative for the city of New York that will focus on transforming underutilized public and private assets into stable community spaces and into stable places for people to make culture, to work, and to collaborate with one another in the process of daily life. That's a very complicated way to say we're not investing in housing. Lots of other people are doing that. And some of the team here at the Community Economic Development Clinic is supporting that work via lawyering. I have 6 more minutes to ask you a hard question. This is the block I live on, and I am so puzzled by how we are wasting the middles of our blocks? This is the most complicated legal question I think I've ever come across. People ask me all the time. I have no idea how to get people to take the fences down and actually open up the centers. But there are a few blocks in Manhattan where people have done that, where the insides of the blocks are a shared asset. But in all of those cases, something extraordinary happened. A rich person bought all of them. One was built that way. Oh no, that's it. And the other ones are in Sweden. So this is a complicated legal or organizing question that I would love for us all to figure out. And that's all I got. I think I'm out of time. Maybe next time with notes. Yeah, there's hands. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. It's a little off topic. It has to do with the removal of green spaces. On the Upper West Side, when I moved there 40-something years ago, there were community gardens dotting the landscape. And in the 80s, the city sold them all off, mostly to developers. So we lost all our gardens. Almost every garden we had up there. Now, the parks that we have up there are being infringed upon, encroached upon. The American Museum of Natural History is taking a part of Teddy Roosevelt Park. And the question is, there is a green area that we're losing that is technically in the Parks Department. And the question is...
It's not. It's, that parcel is not technically in the Parks Department. It isn't, for some reason, and I don't know the answer, but the Department of Cultural Affairs manages that whole parcel. It makes sense because it's a museum, but instead of having Department of Cultural Affairs simply manage the building and parks manage the parks, the whole parcel is in the inventory of Department of Cultural Affairs. There's someone named Dr. Goodwin. Do you know that person?
Carrie.
Who's been, or what's that?
Yeah, Carrie.
Yeah, Carrie, yeah. I put him in touch with a lawyer. Talk to him.
I mean...
Someone needs to go to Borough Hall. No, yeah, someone needs to go to the Borough of Manhattan, Borough President's Office. Look at the official maps to see if on the official paper maps there, if there's something different. In Map Bluto and in every digital reference to that place, the entire thing, even the part that looks like a park and is managed by parks, is in the jurisdiction of Department of Cultural Affairs.
But the question is, as a community, we're organizing, and the question is, you know, where do we go for the kind of resources that you're talking about to, I mean, besides the organizing and putting the pressure on the politicians, where do we go for the kind of resources, what organizations can support this in terms of the scoping for this project?
Partnership for Parks.
Okay.
Partnership for Parks. And anybody else who feels like getting in a fight with the city.
Well,
There's a group called Parks Advocates who might be interested, but I'm not sure the facts are that good from a legal perspective.
I'm sorry?
I'm not sure the facts are very good. You need to go to look at the map at the Borough President's Office. And if it says this is a cultural affairs property, you don't really have a legal claim, you just need to organize like crazy.
Okay.
Every other map says that. Every other map says Department of Cultural Affairs. It does not say parks. But someone needs to go look at the physical map. Yeah, that's okay.
Thank you.
It's a good question, and it's a frustrating situation.
I was just wondering on sort of a more like big picture policy level, what you'd like to see to tip the scales more in favor of community spaces. I mean, there's so many institutional obstacles on the
Let's
other
kill
end.
the tax lien sale. It's up for reauthorization the end of this year. Let's not. Like, let's not. At least let's take out all vacant and abandoned properties, all properties owned by not-for-profit organizations, all properties that serve a community purpose. There are already exemptions to the sale for senior citizens and for veterans, and the sky hasn't fallen. And those people actually still pay their taxes. But particularly for properties that should be tax exempt, they're owned by not-for-profits, we know that it's an error every single time an organization is charged taxes for one of those properties, but that error is compounded when that debt is sold. But vacant and abandoned properties are the flip side, and they're the lost opportunities, right? If we continue to let speculators become the owners of the spaces that aren't being used in our neighborhoods, then we've given up power.
Similar question. So I know that the current administration is interested in mandatory inclusionary zoning on its housing projects and ideas. Is there any chance of somehow trying to build in requirements for funding of green space in surrounding neighborhoods?
It's not gonna work.
Okay.
I mean, because who would enforce it? That's right. If you're interested in learning more about the housing plan, my colleague Adrienne Wedgen from Urban Justice Center will be here on, whenever this says, April 12th, upstairs. We can talk more about the housing plan. In terms of requiring developers to fund the city to do things near them, who would they sign a contract with? I think it's tough. I think we have to have more political will to actually charge taxes to the developers and then redistribute the tax money to the Parks Department instead of relying on this thing called the public-private partnership to try to solve that without a government intermediary.
I was gonna ask a related question to that too. Do you think if there was some reform of sort of the LLC loophole for real estate companies to give a lot of donations to state and city politicians, would that help to tip the scale slightly too, or is it really so systemic?
Yeah, all that stuff's important, but the thing that is in our control is what we do with property that's already public. First of all, don't leave it behind a fence. And debt that is owed to the government. Why are we giving that to private speculators? Time for one more question, and I think actually someone's gonna drive us out of this room. So, there's someone who hasn't spoken. Wanna just entertain us with a new voice? Nobody? Should I at least make everybody say their names, since you've all been here together, and you're like, who are these people? Can we actually do that? Because there's a lot of people here who don't know each other, and some people here go to school here, some don't. Do you have a question?
I was gonna ask, you mentioned in your lecture that HPD is responsible for some of the basement like that lot.
They're not.
But they don't actually designate any resources to open space.
They're not responsible for the planning. They're just the accidental recipient of the property.
So is there any active city-led open space planning, particularly related to community gardens, as opposed to this kind of retroactive, like, this land is left open?
So, in the community-based rezonings that are happening, that's definitely part of the conversation. But I think that's definitely part of the conversation that's an opportunity. But I think it's a missed opportunity, because really calling those community-based rezonings, and we can talk about that more in 2 weeks when we get back together and talk about that here. They're really just upzonings. They're not really community-based anything. They're really just pushing through the upzonings of some key properties that the administration has identified. And though a lot of conversation has happened as part of like the community-based part of it, it hasn't gone into the actual plan that was just signed off on by city council. So yeah, there's planning. Wait, okay, let's do this like lightning round. Just say your first name and how you got here today. Starting with you.
Nicole, I'm from one of the gardens, the 506 acres.
And she's working for the dark side. You could say where you work.
And I work in the planning department for Friends of the High Line. I also teach at the new school.
My name is Olivia Drew. I recently just moved back to New York. I've been in Fordham for 6 years, working various kind of farm, garden, education jobs. I've heard of you.
Cool. So you're not a Fordham student? Welcome.
Hi, I'm Garrett Broad. I'm a faculty member in Communication and Media Studies, and I do research around food systems and environmental justice.
Cool.
I'm Janice Stein, I am a law student here, and I'm academics in the public advocacy department.
Thanks for sponsoring this.
Yeah, I'm Dennis Allen. I'm also a law student here, and with the Fordham Housing Advocacy Project of students working on housing issues and land use issues.
Seth Kaufman, Alliance to Protect Theodore Roosevelt Park. I'm the vice president, and it's newly formed. We need all the help we can get.
Deborah McKean, I apologize, I had this step out before, Alliance to Protect Theodore Roosevelt Park.
Can't hear you.
Deborah McKean, Alliance to Protect Theodore Roosevelt Park.
I'm here from the same group, Susan Browser.
I'm David Goodwin. I'm a librarian upstairs, a law library. I'm also actually an instructor at the University Uptown. And I'm involved in farmers markets, shoes, and landmarks conservancy in Jersey City.
Oh, cool.
Hi, I'm Sherry. I'm from Queens. I'm just looking for a new way to live here other than being a consumer.
Hi, my name is Leonard.
Oh, you gotta speak louder than that.
My name is Leonard. I met you a few days ago, and at a different forum where you talked about this database advocacy group, and I wish to learn more. So that's why I'm here.
My name's Andrew Cohen. I'm an attorney, Brooklyn Law grad. I'm passionate about all forms of justice, but this, I feel like food is one way to achieve it on many levels, and parks and gardens are just one way to get there.
I'm Dewey. I'm at the CED clinic.
Hi, I'm Jane. I'm also at the Community Economic Development CED clinic here.
Hi, I'm Emma. All of us are in the clinic.
Oh, you just took their right to speak away.
I'm Karen, also in the clinic. I'm Pedro.
I'm Diana. I'm an LLM student from Colombia, and I'm part of the CED clinic.
I'm Claudia. I go to the new school and I saw the flyer yesterday.
Awesome.
I'm Renee. I'm a community gardener from Conchitas. I have a garden that will not be here without cheese.
Kathy, I'm part of the CED clinic and the student here at Fordham.
I'm Becca. I'm a student here at Fordham, interested in the intersection of urban and environmental.
Jessica Feldman, I'm a PhD student in sociology at the University of Chicago, doing some research in New York on public parkland preservation.
I'm Brian. I teach the CED.
I'm G. I'm part of the Vine in the Midwood Community Garden, which got took back by the MTA.
That's right. Took me a while. Thank you guys. Now you maybe know a little bit about each other. We have to feed those people cupcakes so they're not too mad at us. But we do have to get out of here. Please take cupcakes.